So, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update and post-summit briefing, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and our special guest a little bit later on, Georg Riekeles, who is Associate Director and Head of the EPC's Europe's Political Economy Programme, as we discuss the outcome of last week's EU summit and consider whether EU leaders are genuinely rising to the challenges posed by the Zeitenwende, that watershed moment in EU history that we are now in following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As always, a totally interactive conversation, questions from me to our panel, and I hope later from all of you. Your microphones are muted for the time being. If you want to ask a question orally, click on the raised hands button and I will unmute you when the time comes. Or you can write your questions, use the Q&A button, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be as brief as possible. So lots to discuss. So let's dive straight in. Janis, just talk us through, give us the headlines, both in terms of what was on the agenda before the summit began and what the discussions actually focused on, and then we'll delve into some of the detail.
Well, if you look into the summit agenda, the original one and the one they stick to, but there was a bit of distortion when it comes to migration, come to that in a second. You had Ukraine on the agenda, you had security and defense on the agenda. That's what they started with, where they relatively quickly agreed on the conclusion that had been obviously prepared. Then they discussed migration, where they had the strongest difficulties, which actually led into a long hour discussion over dinner into deep into the night. 1 o'clock they stopped on Thursday, Friday night. There were some, by the way, at 8 o'clock who were saying maybe this could be a one-day summit, that you could get over it quickly. And then both the Hungarian and the Polish governments came with their disagreement on migration. In the following day, you then discussed relations with China, economy, which relate also, by the way, to economic security and relations with other EU countries. So you had a rich menu on the agenda of things to be discussed, but it was actually migration which dominated the summit, and also the mood around the summit, and also within the building.
And Fabian, looking at that agenda, what was on the agenda, where the focus actually was, would you say that the summit demonstrated that EU leaders are, going back to the title of our event today, rising to that challenge? You've been very critical in the past, arguing they are not waking up to the significance of this moment and what they need to do. Did this summit give you any encouragement?
Well, on one level, yes, because if we actually look what was on the agenda, which was supposed to be discussed, then there are many of the elements there which are important for the strategic future of the European Union, which should be discussed, which should also lead then to conclusions and actions at the European level. And I think that's the second part of my answer. Unfortunately, we didn't get that. What we got were, I would say, rather generic, rather general conclusions without going into any of the really difficult questions which are being posed by some of these, trying to, in many ways, please all sides in the debate and not really facing the hard choices, the trade-offs which come with the watershed moment. So in that sense, I think I would still be very critical. Just talking about some of the important issues is not enough. We need to see actually where we're going to go and see much more of a future orientation in terms of thinking. And I would also apply that to the discussion on migration. We are back exactly at the point where we were before, where we have said that one member state can hold up. In this case, it was 2 member states, but the general principle is that one member state can hold up the whole of the European Union on particular issues, but we still haven't done anything structural to try to address that.
come back on that point in a moment. But Janis, I mean, it is striking that if it hadn't been for migration, as you say, that speculation on the first evening, they could wrap up and all go home at a time when there are so many crucial issues on the agenda. It's striking that they didn't say, well, that's good, it gives us more time to have more substantive discussions. There seemed to be this hurry to get out of there. Were you as disappointed as Fabian is in terms of delivery?
Well, I didn't expect that you would see some radical initiatives in terms of delivery. First of all, we saw the draft council conclusions before the summit took place, so you could see what to expect probably. And we knew that now this was at least the third summit where the EU heads of state and government were trying to signal this sign of unity. That was what is the main objective, although we know that in every area, if you dig a bit deeper, you will see that there are severe differences among the 27. Now in the area of migration, they are again not new, as Fabian was describing it earlier, but it's not a surprise that this is now coming up. Let's not forget there are national elections in Poland. The European elections are closely coming into the equation. So we should not be surprised about that. But if you look into each and every area that was on the agenda, and we will do that in the upcoming 50 minutes, you will see that there are always differences with respect to the level of ambition, with respect to very concrete questions, and some of them are very tough questions. But there is a sense that the EU27 will not be able to agree on them, that would undermine a unity. So one was trying to push that a bit away. And even the discussion on China, where at least you're now having a discussions also at the level of heads of state and government, actually we're seeing a discussion where when it comes to the concrete consequences of what is being discussed, there is no deep exchange. If you look, for example, what actually do we mean when we talk about de-risking? There's not an agreement among the 27. So that means that we are, in terms of the level of ambition, behind where we actually should be.
Absolutely, and we'll come back on China a little bit later on, but let's start with the row that dominated the summit. As you said, the idea these days they're trying to display unity. Well, that went terribly wrong. What was it all about? What actually happened? What were Hungary and Poland seeking? And was this row avoidable or inevitable?
Well, there were two things they were seeking, the governments of Poland and Hungary. One is that there would be, this is the old debate, a voluntary approach to relocation. So contrary to what was agreed in the council on the basis of qualified majority voting, that every member states would themselves decide when it comes to relocation of how to deal with it. And that there was also a plea of, in future, having consensus, unanimity among EU governments when it comes to these kind of issues, which obviously contradicts the EU treaties and was strongly rejected by the other EU 25. But as I said, there was an expectation that the subject would come up, but there was a hope that at the end of the day, it would be 26 versus 1. So everyone against Orban, who was not expected to backtrack from his rhetoric when it comes to migration, but the Polish side also stick to its position till the end. So the 27 could not agree on issuing common conclusions on migration, and we have conclusions of the president when it comes to what was discussed on migration, which reflects, by the way, the two concerns which the Polish and the Hungarian government raised.
Sorry to interrupt you, but is it significant? What is the difference between summit conclusions and a president's conclusions in real terms? I mean, I know what the difference is on paper, but does it make any real difference? Will this have an impact, for example, on completing the negotiations on the Pact on Migration and Asylum, or was it more of a gesture?
I think it's both. Let's be frank. Also on the Polish side, there are elections in fall. It is very important from the perspective of the government to make sure that they will win these elections. And migration is a key issue on which they have betted also in the past. So they want this to be on the agenda. They want to be showcasing that they are defending the interests of Poland when it comes to this issue area. So in many ways, the fact that you did not have joint conclusions of the European Council, but the conclusions of the president in many ways are cosmetic. They are political symbolism, because the agreement that had been reached with respect to the new pact in the council stands. And let's not forget also subsequent agreements that have to be reached also in the trialogue with the two other institutions will, according to the treaties, be based on qualified majority voting. So here actually nothing is at stake. Having said that, Obviously, there's a lot of stake because migration is a key issue, is also fostering all those, playing into the hands of all those who are arguing in similar directions as what we hear from the Polish and the Hungarian government. And second, there are also a lot of question marks with respect to the implementation. So assuming there would be an agreement in the trilogue of the implementation of the new pact, whether the question comes up, how can something be implemented if you have substantial opposition from a number of member states? And let's not forget, on some of these issues, other member states are also, we've seen it also in other policy, are able to hide behind whoever is leading the cause against something. So although it is cosmetic, although there is a high degree of political symbolism, it is still something that should not be underrated.
Thank you. And Fabian, you talked earlier about, you said earlier, we're back where we were before, 1 or 2 member states holding up the rest of the EU. How significant do you think this row was? And how do you see this playing out in the future?
I mean, I think what we see now is a continuation of something which has been going on for a long time, not only about migration, but also about the distance between member states, the way, also the tone and the way debates are conducted has changed, with a lot of performing to the galleries, trying to show the rest of the world. Yes, all of this has been there before, but that's coming back to the title of the session. It hasn't happened in the context of such a important and significant moment in European history. And I think what really is illustrated here is Janis and I published something in the context of sanctions and the Ukraine war about overcoming the ambition unity dilemma. Now we're failing on both. We're failing both on ambition and on unity, which doesn't bode well for the many contentious issues which still need to be decided. And I think as long as we don't then reach the conclusion that something systemic has to change, something has to change about the way we make decisions, not just the individual topic areas, then we're not really going to make progress.
Thank you very much. And just before we move on, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, she played a key role at this summit, trying to negotiate with Hungary and Poland during the summit to see if a way could be found to have summit conclusions. But more broadly, she's celebrating the deal reached this month as a success for her. Is your sense, perhaps Fabian first this time, that the EU's approach now really is playing into the hands of Prime Minister Meloni, but indeed in right-wing forces right across Europe who are gaining the upper hand in many, many countries?
I think what we are seeing at the moment is not just in Italy, but what we're seeing is a resurgence of the populist right-wing opposition to European integration, to sharing sovereignty, essentially neonativism, tribalism, nationalism, whatever we want to call it. And yes, what is happening at the moment is going to play into the hands of many of those actors, because as long as they can point at the European level as failing, as not addressing the issues, as not being able to deal decisively with the challenges we are facing, they will always suggest that the solution is giving them more power, electing them in the next election. Now, clearly, when you look at their policies, when you look at what they are able to do, this is not true. But it is a way they can broaden their appeal. And I think this is something also to look out for at the European election next year. I think it's going to be a rather significant strengthening of those forces on the more extreme fringes.
Janis?
Yes, I think that Fabian unfortunately is right. It's playing into the hands of right-wing political forces. It played into their hands in the past, and it again is playing into their hands this time around. And one can say that Giorgia Meloni is handling this very smartly, politically very smartly. She is selling it as her success. She's arguing that without us, there would not have been this compromise that is breached in the Council, which at the end of the day is a hardening when it comes to migration issues. In the divide between responsibility and security, there's a clear leaning towards security aspects of migration and less on the issues of responsibility. And I'll use the word, although I am critical sometimes of it, of solidarity among the U27, but also with those who are knocking on our doors. So it is moving in one direction, but it's still being used by all those who are saying we need to do more with respect to securing our borders. We need to do more in order to avert people coming to us. This is playing into their narrative, because the overall narrative has become that actually migration is something negative. And that is, I think, the big underlying problem we're seeing, that we're viewing migration as being something negative, whereas we're seeing that all economic indications in many EU member states are that we need more indication that there are people who are missing from our labor forces, especially also due to the demographic factor and the post-COVID consequences.
Just one follow-up quick question. I have also seen suggestions that some countries beginning to talk about new approaches to returns, which could end off looking like something that has been very sharply criticised, and indeed to be found in contravention of the European the Convention on Human Rights, the Rwanda policy in the UK. Just very briefly, Janis, is this seriously under contemplation, or is this just some noises by a few countries?
No, there are some who are contemplating this. There are some who want to be even tougher when it comes to migration. They want out-of-the-box thinking, as it's being called. And by the way, the Commission and also President von der Leyen has indicated that we are ready to do more out-of-the-box thinking. And there are some who would want to push things as far as what you were just describing. Also, this idea of the deal with Tunisia being the way forward, if you would simplify it, cash for migrant controls. I'm being a bit clear in my expression, but at the end of the day, this is what it seems to be about. So there are many who want to push even harder in the direction of trying to make sure that when it comes to migration, we will be following a one-sided policy. This is exactly what I meant earlier. It is distorting the actual needs which you need in Europe with respect to migration. That's exactly what plays into the hands of all those who want us to follow a different path in future, and there are among them mostly right-wing populists throughout Europe.
Thank you. Let us move on. We have so much ground to cover today. Let us turn our attention now to Ukraine. We had an address, as has now become traditional at these summits, from President Zelensky. This summit came just a very short time after those dramatic developments, or what seemed to be for a moment very dramatic developments in Russia, also in Belarus. Janis, just in terms of what was on the table, what did they talk about, and did we learn anything new from the summit conclusions?
There's a lot of repetition in the European Council conclusions, and there are good reasons why there are also repetitions, because there's always a need to forcefully convey the message which the EU27 agree on when it comes to assisting Ukraine, when it comes to the integrity, when it comes to the independence of the country, when it comes to the support of Ukraine and in the war against Russia. So there is a lot of repetition, which is, by the way, updated according to the developments which we've seen off the ground. And I think there is need for that. But there are also some severe differences among the 27. One relates to the question of security commitments. How strong would the commitments, the security commitments, be with respect to Ukraine? There's also a link to the question of what kind of NATO membership discussion we would have in future in terms of potentially Ukraine at some point in time joining NATO. So there are a lot of differences which do not only show themselves with respect to the fact that there is resistance from Ireland, Austria, Malta, the neutral countries which are pushing back when it comes to security commitments, but there are also differences among other EU countries, with a lot of countries, including France and Germany, pushing for bilateral security arrangements in the futures, and others saying we need more than that in order to make sure that Ukraine will not only get the continuous support of the EU and other countries, but also that Ukraine will have a perspective in terms of being sure that it can rely on the EU member states, on the UK and the US and others too, by the way, when it comes to the security situation of the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Fabian, I want to come on to the point also of enlargement again in a moment, but just on this question of security commitments, and the reference in the summit conclusions says that the EU is standing ready to contribute together with partners to future security commitments to Ukraine, but doesn't give any detail. I think it says we're looking at what the modalities might be, what the possibilities might be. How far do you believe the EU 27 are ready to go? And how far should they be ready to go?
Well, I think I know you were going to talk about accession in a moment, but I think we also have to see those two together, because these are two sides of the same coin. We need to look at what kind of anchoring we will have for Ukraine within broadly the Western system, and that means we have to talk about NATO membership, and we have to talk about EU membership. And we shouldn't forget that with EU membership also comes a security guarantee. Whether that is reliable is a different question. But I think this is an overall discussion around the future of Ukraine and where it fits within the current mechanisms. And are they ready to have that discussion? No, they're nowhere near ready. They're essentially saying, yes, we recognize there's an issue, and we recognize that we are going to have to do something at some point, but that's pretty much as far as it goes.
President Zelensky, Janis, said, was emphasizing and talking again about the importance of accession to the EU for Ukraine in his address to the summit. How likely does it appear now, based on the sort of discussions in the corridors and around the margins of the summit, that the EU will decide at its December summit to start negotiations with Ukraine? And if I could link to that, just in the interest of time, a question from Riekeles in our audience saying, what is your interpretation of the European Council conclusions that reaffirm the EU's commitment to the membership perspective of the Western Balkans and the acceleration of the merit-based accession process, while inviting the High Rep and the Commission to provide a report on the state of EU-Turkey relations? Does this indicate, asks Isa, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, a potential recalibration of the EU's approach to its relations with Turkey? So when it comes to Ukraine, Moldova, Balkans, do we see any more light about what is likely to happen? And is there any chance of a recalibration on Turkey, do you think?
Well, when it comes to Western Balkans, but also to the trio, including Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, I think that there is an increasing pressure. And there's not only an increasing pressure coming from these countries, including from Ukraine, and let's not forget, they have been the catalyst of a renewed debate about enlargement. So in many ways, the future of EU enlargement will be decided on how we deal with Ukraine. In many ways, by the way, will be decided upon that question. So there is a momentum, there is a push. Also, by the way, in the exchange with the President of the European Parliament at the beginning, the traditional exchange of the European Council, Metsola came and said the European Parliament wants the European Council to take a decision in December to open negotiations with Ukraine. But having said that, we know that one opening accession negotiation can mean something, but it can also mean less than that. It can drag on for a very long period of time. There are different ways of having it dragged on, relating both to the developments in the countries themselves, but also in terms of the ability of the EU to absorb new members. So that's the other part of the coin. And I think on that side, and the latter, we're seeing that actually, yes, there is more discussion about as to whether there's a need and how to reform the EU. But actually, when it comes to putting political capital into that, investing political energy into it, we're far away from that.
Well, we had an intriguing development, though, Janis, at the summit, with a breakfast on Friday morning by this group. I don't know whether they called themselves or somebody else has coined the phrase, the Amigos, named after the hotel in Brussels where they met. Nothing more significant than that. But 10 EU countries, including France and Germany, discussing on Friday morning at breakfast how to manage the process of enlargement. Why was this meeting called? Why only 10 of them? I think they're due to discuss this anyway at the informal summit, next summit, the EU summit in October in Spain. What was behind this meeting, and does it suggest there is new momentum behind this? Janis, just in terms of what actually happened, and then Fabian, your interpretation of it.
Well, first of all, not a lot happened, but I think it is the consequence of the pressures increasing. So these 10 countries, but it could have also been 8 or could have been 12. And many, if you look into the individual positions of these countries when it comes to the other side of the coin, i.e. making the EU fit to enlarge, which includes EU reforms from an institutional governance perspective, but also very much policy perspective, there are huge differences among these countries. So coming together is, I think, a signal of understanding that we need to respond in one way or the other, but that does not mean that you're actually ready to do it, or that you're ready to find an agreement among all those who need to find an agreement, including those of the Amigo group who have major differences of opinion among them, but also all the other member states. So I think we're still very far away of having the momentum we need to actually make sure that not only are we saying that we want to have the EU enlarged, but actually preparing itself for it.
Okay, but Fabian, you talked earlier when we were talking about migration, about changing the way we take decisions. Do you take this meeting as a sign that it may be possible to make progress in changing the way we take decisions? What do you read into? I'm still slightly puzzled if it's on the summit agenda for the informal summit in October as to why 10 of them felt the need to get together over breakfast while they were still arguing about migration, but I don't know whether we can get to the bottom of that today or not. Fabian?
If I put a very critical perspective on it, I would call it performance politics. It's trying to show you're doing something even though you're not actually doing anything. And I think this is along the line of many different topics we could look at. While countries are happy to try to point the finger at other countries for what they are not doing, they are not willing to overcome their national taboos when it comes to these topics. So in the end, it doesn't actually help us to move towards a conclusion. Yes, it is good that these things are on the agenda, that there are discussions, but what I'm really missing is anyone putting forward a real plan, a real suggestion, a real recommendation about how we can move this forward and what taboos they are willing to give up. And maybe I think also in that context, I mean, one thing to also note here is the blackmail Orban was also putting in the background about withholding support for Ukraine. This is another illustration of if you are not willing to come to conclusions together, but you're just willing to fight with each other on some of these topics, then we're not going to make progress. And I think this is extremely worrying because there are many more issues we should actually be reacting. Just to go back a bit on the Ukraine discussion and what happened in Russia, there wasn't any reflection, as far as I can see, on the wider consequences of what happened in Russia. What will happen in those areas of the world where the Wagner Group is now going to be less present, where potentially Russian troops are being drawn back into Moscow. We are having no strategic discussion. And in the end, this is what is really missing, a real strategic discussion which looks at common strategic goals, which then says what are the trade-offs, what are the sacrifices each country is willing to make to get there. Instead, what we're having essentially is to a large extent, performance politics.
Indeed. Just before we move on, I wanted to read out a comment from the new chair of the EPC's governing board, Declan Kelleher, talking about the conclusions on Ukraine and two elements of it in particular, one relating to military support for Ukraine, the second to the security commitments issue we were discussing, where it said, in this regard, these commitments will be taken, quotes, in full respect of the security and defense policy of certain member states and taking into account the security and defense interests of all member states. Declan says inclusion of those sentences was disappointing and sends the wrong signals to Ukraine and to Russia. Better had the sentences not been included, as they are not necessary to reflect the positions of neutral states. Also, he says the neutrals need to be careful that they don't become the excuse for any weakening of EU commitments in future. I just wanted to read that out. We'll leave that there. I want to move on now because we still have a lot of ground to cover, to the issue of security and defence. And I'm delighted at this stage to invite Georg Riekeles, Associate Director of the EPC, to join us. Great to have you with us again, Georg. Welcome back to our conversations. So Charles Michel, in his invitation letter to the summers, reminded EU leaders that last year in Versailles, and I quote, "We decided to take greater responsibility for our security and defence. Now is the time to assess where we stand and discuss how to speed up our work so we live up to our commitments." Did they? Did they look at ways to speed up progress? Are they living up to their commitments? It doesn't seem, Georg, looking at the conclusions on the face of it, that we moved much further forward.
Well, perhaps no, Jackie. I mean, one can always have these glass half full or half empty discussions at the EU level. And I don't focus so much when it comes to security and defense on this particular summit, because I do think that things are happening. The EU is participating in delivery weapons to Ukraine with the EU footprint on, sticking its head out, doing things that, for instance, NATO can't do or won't do for good reasons. There's a clearinghouse up in Avenue Kortenberg that is organizing this. One is paying for the tanks that are going. One has this military assisted mission that has been training 10,000s of Ukrainian soldiers for these spring-summer offensives. We have this ASAP, this Act in support of ammunition production, which is, I think, a direct response to the Versailles agenda, to the Council's call for urgent delivery of ammunition to Ukraine, and also to help member states refill their stocks. And I find this ASAP absolutely remarkable. It is like I would say, an embryo of the US Defense Production Act of 1950, where you have a legal framework now at the EU level to organize wartime economy and to push orders of member states up front together with the industry. So that is the glass half full. I think things that look small are actually quite significant. Of course, at the same time, in defense and European defense, you would always say that the glass is half empty. For the rest, obviously, the US is everything. US is European hard security these days. The US is NATO. The US is strategic capabilities and orientations. And it's really the only political security interlocutor that count. And I think what is sad to see is that view is shared in most European capitals. It's shared in Moscow. Maybe it's not shared in Paris. And I think it's really interesting also that it's no longer shared in Washington. It's not what the Americans want. So there is still a question to ask. Can we do more? For sure. Do we need more treaties? That I'm not 100% sure. Fabian spoke about the need for something systemic to change. I think that possibility is there in the treaties. There's a possibility of decreeing common defense, Article 42.2, but this comes down to political will to take significant steps further.
Thank you very much. Fabian, would you share that assessment? And you were talking earlier about, the degree to which recent developments in Russia, what's happening in Belarus should influence more the discussions we're having. Do you perceive a greater sense of urgency to do what it takes?
I mean, certainly we have seen quite a bit, and I would agree with Georg there that it's not that there's been no action at the European level. In many ways, there's been unprecedented action also, because we are now dealing with things where in the past there was always a huge taboo about doing this at the European level. So we have already overcome some of these barriers. But I would still say that, as with many issues when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, that we are still reacting. We are still seeing where are the bottlenecks, where are the difficulties at this moment in time, and then trying to patch up the system to make sure that we can deliver at least in the short run. I think if I look at, for example, the defense industry, defense and security industry in Europe, what is needed now is really a longer term perspective. We need to start talking about what are we going to do about the next 10 years, because to rebuild the capacity which has already been transferred to Ukraine, to modernize what we have there, and to continue to supply Ukraine, also now with increasingly more modern equipment, is going to take a complete turnaround in our defense and security industry in a way we haven't seen in decades. So those are not the discussions we're having at the moment. So I agree with Georg. Yes, there's some glass half full, but maybe I would tend to say there's a bit more glass half empty than there should be at this moment.
Janis, and if you are also more glass half empty, I don't know, but if you are, what for you are the key factors that are keeping the EU from boosting defence cooperation in the way that now seems so evidently necessary post the Russian invasion of Ukraine? What lies behind this? And do you have any optimism that the necessary urgency can be injected in those areas where, as Georg was pointing out, the glass is half empty?
Well, I would start by saying the glass we have to fill is a totally different one. If we would have been now in the post-2014 annexation of Crimea world, and we would be seeing what is happening at the European level when it comes to security and defense, I would have said, wow, we're making things move in a direction where it's necessary in order to prepare for what potentially might come in future. But in the post-24 February of last year world, the post-Zeitenwende world, or the world which is going through the Zeitenwende, I think the glass we have to fill is much bigger. The level of ambition needs to be much bigger. So all what Georg has said is correct. And it is in many ways remarkable if you think of where we were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But in terms of where we are now, I think it's not sufficient. And I think we need to listen carefully to those who are telling us we need to do more, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, while they at the same time say, but we cannot do more at the European level, so let's rely on the US, where then the question mark comes up. So what happens if after the post-24 elections in the US? Will we be ready to assume more responsibility? And here I think that contrary to what we have all been doing, what we are doing is not enough. We need to do far more. And I think, by the way, the incidents of Saturday a week ago should have shown us that there is probably more unclarity ahead of us. We do not know how things will develop in Moscow. We also need to be aware that that there are limits of how we can interfere in what happens in Moscow, besides supporting Ukraine, which is probably the strongest way of making sure that the developments in Moscow potentially go in a better direction. But uncertainty will be with us for a very long time.
Indeed.
So we need to prepare for that. And for me, that we're not responding to that adequately enough. And I hope that if we sit here in 5 or 10 years' time, we will not be saying again, we didn't do enough. We did more, but we didn't do enough. I hope that we will not find ourselves in that situation.
Thank you very much. I want to link the last two topics that they focused on the summit together, namely the discussion on economic security and on relations with China, because the conclusions on China talk about reducing critical dependencies and vulnerabilities, talk about de-risking and so on, as Janis, you mentioned earlier. Just firstly on China, EU-China itself. The language appeared to be, the conclusions language appears to be relatively mild, rather balanced, talking about a multifaceted approach, describing China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, but calling for constructive and stable relations. There were EU leaders on the way in talking more and more about we mustn't be naive, China is more and more of a rival, but this is very different language, the sort of language we're hearing, Janis, out of the US. We heard recently the controversy over Joe Biden referring to Xi Jinping as a dictator, caused a huge kickback from the Chinese. What do you read into the language of these summit conclusions?
Well, first of all, the summit conclusions didn't change compared to the draft. Because there was an agreement found before the European Council, and there's also consciousness for not wanting to have a discussion among EU leaders when it comes to Council conclusions, because one knows how difficult these issues are and how big the differences are among the EU 27. So the wish was there then to have a discussion about the long-term strategic relationship with China, while not interfering with what actually had been put down on paper. But you could sense before the summit that a good numbers of governments were wanting to tune down the tone when it comes to China. That there are a good number of countries, especially in the western part of the European Union, which for different reasons are concerned that a worsening of the relationship with China would be not in their interest, whether that comes from those who have a strong business interest, that includes, by the way, Berlin, but also others, including Paris, which are skeptical to follow the US approach, which you already mentioned, Jacki. So there are differences of opinion. There was a push ahead of the summit to tune down the tone vis-a-vis Beijing, and there you can really see again the differences between the two sides, between the different sides within the European Union. And I just want to relate this to something we discussed earlier when it came to also to the Ukraine, to security guarantees. We should be careful not to frame this as a lack of understanding among the EU27 only, because if you look into national debates themselves, you will see that on many of these issues, if there are debates at all, that there are controversial debates within member states. So there are disagreements which go far beyond simply arguing, can we find an agreement among the 27? It involves debates at the national level where we have major differences. Indeed. And here, unfortunately, we still do not have a transnational exchange about these issues. You don't have people from other parts of Europe reflecting on what their concerns are, what their lessons are from previous experiences in other member states.
Okay, I want to come back in a moment with you, Georg, and link this to the economic security discussion. But before I do that, Fabian, your reading of that language, but also what implications do you think this might have for EU-US relations, given that divergence of approach, and indeed, more broadly, its geopolitical implications?
I think what we're seeing in the summit conclusions is pretty much a continuation of what we had before, that ultimately the European Union is trying to straddle all of the different aspects of the relationship, not wanting, on the one hand, to be naive, to give away issues where also security is concerned. On the other hand, a very real recognition of the economic impact a worsening relationship with China would have. So in my interpretation, nothing much has changed in terms of the European Union's approach to China, at least not in the short term. Yes, we have had a worsening of the relationship over time. We've had more caution, but still we have those divisions. And that, of course, also poses then the question of how the US is going to react to that, not just in the short term. I think the medium perspective is much more important. And my view would be that the US inevitably will be demanding from Europe to be more decisive, to be clearer about where we stand in relation to China. And so far, I don't think we have a very good answer because we haven't agreed anything between us.
Indeed not. Georg, as I say, this linked to the discussion on enhancing the European Union's economic resilience and security because of that reference in the summit conclusions on China to reducing critical dependencies and vulnerabilities and so on. What concretely on the issue of economic resilience and security did they discuss? Again, same question as I'm asking before. Lots of nice language, but did we get anywhere? Do you see concrete progress on this issue since the last discussion in March?
Well, first on China, maybe. I think it's, if we observe what's happening, what the reality is pretty much that Europe now is in the process of falling into a crack between the US and China, and that we don't know what to do about it. And then we're sticking to the old language. And I would agree very much with Fabian. The more we are undecided, the bigger the pressures will be on both sides. And I think there was a lot of talk a couple of weeks or months back about Macron's visits to Beijing. I actually found Scholz's visits to Beijing equally revealing, November last year. Because in reality, when everybody was talking a lot about reducing dependencies, the message, to me at least, that Scholz went to Beijing with and to Washington was one not of reducing dependencies, but of mutual dependency. The idea that Germany could still negotiate that. This idea that, at the same time as Costco invests in the port of Hamburg, BASF invests massively in Zhangjiang in China. So there's this idea that you somehow can pull off a relationship of equals. And I think that is part of this rather short-term naivety we are still in today in Europe, also with relation to economic security. We see very much, of course, that Russia is the geopolitical storm, but China is the geopolitical climate change. And I think we should be quite worried about our capacity to prepare for a crisis that is not immediate. We're dealing reasonably okay with the Russian crisis, but a crisis that is sort of a slow motion crisis building up, I'm not sure we're capable of dealing adequately with that for the time being. And I think this is really sort of the background for also Europe's economic security strategy, or the consultation document that was put out by the Commission, because that's also how they are framing it. We are very far from the count. Of course, talking of the risking is fine, but what is needed is a very profound aggiornamento in a way of thinking, our tools and our policies. And
do they even agree what de-risking actually means, Georg, at this stage?
Pardon?
Do they concretely agree on what it actually means to de-risk?
Well, I think the German example I took in a way shows that they don't. There are member states in Europe that would want to take a much clearer line on China and maybe be more ambitious in terms of the risking. Looking, for instance, also on trade dependencies. We're going to have a difficult debate on outward investment screening, but I think where it's really what we're really lacking is a complete picture here. It's not only about the defensive instruments, such as sanctions, tools that might be used in the future, export controls where the Americans are pushing us, investment screening, inwards and outwards, anti-coercion mechanisms, but it's also ultimately building economic security. Is not only about the defensive agenda, it's also about having a running faster agenda. And I think in this running faster agenda, a positive industrial policy, of course, it's about opening other markets one can rely on, but it also means building up own capacities and strategic technologies for Europe. And if you look at what the Commission put on the table, this platform they call STEP, it is very, very little in terms of a response. I can just take one example.
Briefly,
these days, we are talking about in Europe that we need to build up our battery industries. Germany is giving €1 billion in subsidies to Northvolt. Meanwhile, what is happening? The Chinese are putting a brake on graphite exports to European battery producers. Why are they doing this? Because they don't want Europe to have a batteries industries. They know that they can control the value chain. They can have big actors. They don't want us to exist. So the Americans have found efficient ways of responding to this. In Europe, we're still very far from the count.
Thank you very much. Fabian, you wrote a discussion paper on economic security recently. I want to come back to what you said in that paper, but also to the title of our event today when we talk about rising to the challenges of the Zeitenwende. In this area, do you believe EU leaders are showing they know what they need to do? And if not, what can and should be done? I know your paper contained a number of recommendations. What would you highlight as particularly important?
I think maybe I will be even more pessimistic when I respond to that. I think what I tried to set out in my paper, and whether people agree with the detail of that or not, but what I try to set out is really that to take economic security seriously requires a paradigm shift. We need to think differently about how we intervene, and I think Georg already mentioned one of the key challenges which we are having, which is to genuinely have a European industrial policy which can underpin the economic security agenda. If we are not going to have that, then I'm afraid we are stuck with rather hollow sounding words. We can make statements about de-risking, but unless we have the policy instrument which can actually deliver that, it remains hollow. And that, I think, is the big problem which we are seeing across this whole economic security agenda. At the moment, it's still at the level of statements. It's generally statements no one can disagree with, but when it comes to how do we concretely set that into reality, we have huge barriers. And one of the biggest barriers here is that we have to recognize that we have a trilemma here between a common industrial policy which can address these fundamental transformations which we are facing, the common market where we are doing things together, and the wish by member states to continue to do things, to continue to have the means, the instruments at the national level. Something will have to give between those three. And what is going to give, in my opinion at the moment, is going to be the single market, because in the end, we are just going to renationalize some of these powers, and we are risking one of the biggest assets we have.
And there was a call in the summit conclusions for a high-level report on the future of the single market to be presented at next March's council. Maybe we should watch that space very closely. Janis, a brief comment to this, if you would, and then Georg, I'd like to come back with you on what's been happening in France. And we have an intriguing question about the European elections, which I'd like to try and squeeze in before we close. But Janis, your reaction to this discussion about economic security?
Well, I think both with respect to the reactive and the proactive dimension, because Georg, you were right when you were saying that actually, if you want to defend your interests, you also need to make sure that you have a proactive, future-oriented agenda which strengthens your economy. With respect to both aspects and dimensions, I think what the underlying problem is that there is a severe level of distrust among member states. And there is a distrust when it comes to China as to whether one can believe in the position of the others, and there's a distrust among the 27 when it comes to the question, what would happen if there is actually a severe confrontation between the US and China, and how would we then individually and collectively be able to react? Would we side with the right side? Now, I'm not saying that there is an easy answer to these questions, but what I'm seeing, and I think it's getting worse, it's not getting better, that there's an increasing distrust when it comes to these kind of questions. And also the summit showed that. So in the run-up to the summit, the fact that some countries, especially in Western Europe, were pushing for a softer language on China is being viewed in other parts of Europe in a very negative way. And I think that is playing beyond the question of, how concretely you will be able to develop with XYZ of the proactive or the reactive agenda is playing exactly into the position of us not being able to agree. And I think that is which goes deeper. And by the way, the experience with Ukraine and since 2008 is playing into this division among the EU 27, because people are reminded of mistakes that have been committed. And Georg, you were referring to Germany. There's a lot of skepticism with respect to Germany, with respect to what happened on the Ukraine front in the past, but also what is happening now with respect to China. And that means that we have fundamental problems among the 27.
Thank you. I want to turn to the question of France, because the French President Emmanuel Macron had to leave the summit early to attend an emergency cabinet meeting on the riots which erupted in France after a teenager was killed in the suburbs of Paris by police. He also had to cancel a state visit to Germany, which Olaf Scholz said he understood, but also couldn't resist saying, but it wouldn't happen here, which I thought was a tad unnecessary. Georg, how serious is the situation in France, and does it have implications for the European Union?
Well, I think it's clearly quite serious when you see the level of violence and destruction. So I think we all agree that police brutality is awful. It's unacceptable, whether in France or in the US. But the situation we are looking at now is, well, there was a fireman that was killed overnight. There was attempted homicide on the mayor. I think the 6,000 cars have been burnt, 1,000 buildings put on fire or degraded, 250 police stations, 700 injured police, some by firearms. So I think what France has woken up to now the past few days is really the question of what is the problem here, what is fundamentally at stake. And some will say that French society is systematically racist. I think a lot of are pointing the other direction and saying that there is a huge problem with incivility. In the context of the riots that took place in the linked to the pensions reform, Macron used the word of the decivilization of France. So this idea that there's nothing that keeps society together anymore, and people stop responding or abiding to basic societal norms.
And does it have implications for the European Union, or is this a French problem?
I think it will have implications for the European Union at different levels. First of all, I see that debate is turning in France, very much against the line of what was a part of the left. Of course, Mélenchon, La France Insoumise, went quite far in refusing to condemn the violences. Then people start saying, okay, but then there's no republic anymore. But this will, I think, harden the political discourse in France, and the opinion will move forward further to the right. I think what we are seeing, this competition of the control of the territory, where you see groups that don't want to support the social contract. In the end, that is just a trend of I'd say a resurgence of a more conservative and harder right across Europe. I think the spark we see now that we saw also linked to the pension debates, how suddenly a spark can light the fire. It really points to the difficulties of our societies to stay united, to cope, to adapt. So it is pointing to all the difficulties to govern in the future. And I think it's really these are the tremors of our societies facing these fundamental transformations.
Indeed, and linking this back,
economic security. People are seeing that the quality of life in the future will not be that of the past, and it also, of course, has a direct impact on Macron's international and European agenda. We have the capital state visit to Germany. King Charles visit. So it's in stark contrast to what Macron came with, which was when he first became president, which was to say, choose France. This is a place for do business. We can be central, we are modern, etc. It's really the reactive forces of society that are taking taking the hold.
Sorry, we are almost out of time, and I want to squeeze this European election question in, but Fabian, just quickly, implications also from France when we talk about the Zeitenwende, because as Georg saying, making it harder to develop and deliver responses to these big challenges. In literally a minute, if you would, how significant do you think this is for Europe?
I think you could put two interpretations on it, a more pessimistic one and a more optimistic one. The pessimistic one essentially says we can't really do anything together at the European level because things are so difficult at home that we can't agree on anything. We could also have a more optimistic one, which says maybe because the national level is so constrained to move, the European level is the only space where we can still move forward in some of these areas. I leave it up to everyone themselves to see whether they believe the more optimistic or the more pessimistic version. But I think what this also highlights, and I think this is coming back to a long-standing theme in our updates, is that we are not preparing for the future properly, and that we are not thinking about what are the possible scenarios and how are we going to react to this. I think we have to look at what has been happening in France, also with the view saying what happens if some of these forces will become, the president will take power within the country. And what are the implications then? And we are still not preparing for those kind of eventualities.
Thank you. I want to squeeze in this last question, which links back to our conversation, Janis, at the beginning about Italy's role negotiating with Poland and Hungary in the summit on migration issues. And it's from Tommaso Gallavotti, who says, in Italy, the press is writing very often about a possible majority in the next European Parliament formed by the EPP and the ECR, plus a part of Renew. EU. Personally, says Tommaso, I don't think they've got the numbers without the S&D. Do you think this perception is correct, or is there a possibility of a majority in the parliament without the socialists, considering the fractures on the European right? We will have many more in-depth conversations about the European elections, but it's an intriguing thought. What do you think, Janis? You're muted, hun. There we go.
It still happens. Sorry for that. But first of all, I think that we're still 1 year ahead, or roughly a year ahead of the EP elections. It's extremely difficult to make a prognosis. From today's perspective, I think the chances are high for different reasons that the right-wing parties will do very well in the next elections. I think that there's a good chance that the turnout will be lower. And given that often populist forces are more able of motivating their voters to go and vote, chances are high. And plus that if the EU is no longer in the center of attention in national debates, and it is not in many EU countries, and that the chances are high that the combination of low turnout and the fact that that radical forces are able to motivate their voters to go and vote, that the outcome of the EP elections will lead to a strengthening of far-right populists. But does that then mean that you would have a kind of coalition within the European Parliament? Here I would be more skeptical, because if it's correct that in the European Parliament election, right-wing forces will do very well, also the traditional center-right will be very wary of having any kind of coalition with them at the European level, because that might have a counter-negative effect from their perspective at home. So I think what will happen is a far more selective approach. So saying, with whom of these more right-wing forces can we find and collide on certain issues, maybe even more structurally, and many of whom the answer will be we can't, but with some we can. And here it's so interesting to witness what's happening in Italy, to see how Meloni is playing it also at the European level, where she has been very successful in persuading other political forces more in the center to be closer to them. So I think we need to be more selective when it comes to what Tommaso's question was, and look into more concrete developments. And I'm sure we're going to be doing that over the upcoming 11 months.
I'm sure we are, and I'm sure we'll come back to the topic of the Polish elections. We have, of course, a Spanish general election coming up as their presidency begins as well. So lots to watch out for on the political landscape. We are out of time. I'm sorry. Fascinating discussion. So many topics to cover. Janis, Fabian, and Georg, thank you very much. Just to flag up a couple of EPC events this week. On Wednesday, one linking to the theme of resilience, building resilient European societies, promoting innovation in healthcare systems, and on Thursday, clean air, time to capture the benefits. And we'll be back in September with another update immediately after the State of the Union address by Ursula von der Leyen. So in the meantime, it only remains for me to wish you, when it comes, a lovely summer break, and we'll see you in the autumn. Thank you very much. Take care and have a good summer. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jacki.
Thank you. Bye. See you.